Christian Gelder is a Macquarie University Research Fellow at Macquarie University, Sydney. He completed his Ph.D. at the University of Cambridge in 2022, which considered the way that poetry became the object of intense scientific study at the end of the 19th century. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in Modernism, Modernity, the Cambridge Quarterly, the Australian Humanities Review, and Yes Journal of the Circle for Lacanian Ideology Critic. With Robert Boncado, he is the author of Malarmé, Ghashir, Munir, Baju. He is interested in the singularity of literary thinking, psychoanalysis, poetry and poetics, and the history of psychiatry. He is currently working on a project entitled Adapting the Psyche, American Psychiatry, Modern Literature, and the Origins of Mental Health, which traces the epistemology and politics of the literature associated with the mental hygiene movement. The first fruit from this project, the paper he is giving today, is currently under consideration with American literature. We welcome Christian Gelder to Yale Summit 2023.
Thank you very much for watching the AV. Thank you so much. Just a little reminder before we get started. If you have any questions during the session, you can put them in the Q&A section, and we will take them up after the talk is over. So please, everyone, I request you to put your questions in the question and answer section. Now, without further ado, I request our esteemed speaker for the session, Christian Gelder, sir, to guide us all on this very important topic. I would like to now hand over the session to Gelder, sir. Over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. That's the loveliest introduction I've ever received. So thank you. And I must say, it's so delightful to be here. One of the quirks of our contemporary era is that I'm here in Sydney, Australia, and able to talk to you elsewhere in the world. So an absolute pleasure. And thank you to Taryn for inviting me. As I say, it's a real pleasure. I just want to, if I may, make a few remarks about what the kind of work I'm doing is. I hate to break the news, but I'm going to be slightly more critical about the idea of mental health than perhaps one would ordinarily hear. And part of the reason for that is not for any other reason than, the idea of mental health is an extremely contemporary idea. It's an idea which really, I don't know what it was like in India, but in Australia, where I'm from, and in the UK, where I did my PhD, it was very much the case that the COVID pandemic increased the discourse around mental health. And it's an extraordinary historical thing to have happened that we underwent extreme political change. We were asked to assent to, an incredible disruption in our usual ordinary ways of living. And in return, what we were asked to do is focus on our mental health, right? So changes are going on in the political sphere, and the answers and solutions that states and governments and countries give us is to look inside, to think about our own relationship to the world, to think about our subjectivity. So there is a kind of relation between psychiatry and the political sphere. And this project really came out of that relation because I wanted to understand the history behind the term mental health, where it came from, how it was first used, and how it became a kind of term of political to political assignation, I guess. And the second thing I want to say is that actually literature plays a fundamental role in this, as we might see. And more than that, I think what I've always been interested in as a scholar of literature, and I hope to hear from some other people about what they think too in the panel, is that I'm always interested in literature's singularity, what literature does, the way that literature knows, and the way that literature thinks. That means that it's a kind of singular object. It has its own unique way of thinking. And that unique way of thinking has historically contributed to disciplines we might not often associate with literature and literary production. And in this case, literature was, in the first 40 years of psychiatry from 1880 to 1920, really, very much a kind of constitutive part of what it meant to, form psychiatric knowledge. So literary knowledge became essential to psychiatric knowledge. And then if I say one more quick thing before prefacing this paper, Clifford Whittingham Beers is very much the founder of the mental hygiene movement. And he writes this book, A Mind That Found Itself, and it's written in reaction to a series of kind of delusions he has. They're kind of clinically diagnosed as delusions. What happens is he's a kind of Connecticut bourgeois individual who, is wants to be a Wall Street man, he says, make lots of money in the center of America, and he has a very troubling psychic break. And after that psychic break, he's put into a state hospital in Connecticut. And when he comes out, when he's cured, he has this resolve to change the status of mental health in America, to create the most, profound change in attitudes towards mental health and so on. But he goes through many things, as we'll see in this paper. So with that being said, am I able to get the PowerPoints up at all? Is that possible? Ah, you're amazing. Thank you so much. Could you click to the second slide?
Yes, sir. Just a second. Yeah.
Beautiful. I'll just say change slides if that's okay.
Yes, definitely, sir.
Amazing. Thanks. So this paper is called Psychical Adaptation, Clifford Whittingham Beers is a Mind That Found Itself, the Functional Psychoses and the Manufacture of Mental Health in Modern America. And it's about Beers's book. So A Mind That Found Itself, Beers's book, was from its beginning burdened by an overdetermined literary imaginary. In the book itself, Beers compares his literary voice to Dante's, writing, "My Inferno will make the Divine Comedy look like a French farce." At the end of A Mind That Found Itself, Beers reproduces a letter sent to him by the famous Connecticut psychologist William James, who comments on the book's superior literary style. As for contents, James went on to say, A Mind That Found Itself is, quote, fit to remain in literature as a classic. Similar comparisons were made after the book's publication, with some like James himself commenting on its peculiar fictional quality. One of the book's first readers, Wilbur L. Cross, the Sterling Professor of English at Yale at the time, thought that Beers's narrative was comparable to De Quincey's Confessions, noting a likeness between Beers's prose and romantic drug-induced reverie. Indeed, despite the book's relative obscurity in discussions of early 20th century American literature, contemporary historians of psychiatry still echo the idea that the book is, quote, an eloquent autobiography of genuine literary merit, viewing its prose, its writing style, as the reason for its subsequent influence. So Beers's book attracted these comparisons not because it was canonized by literary critics, which, is ordinarily how a book attracts attention and gains influence. Rather, A Mind That Found Itself became a touchstone for early American psychiatrists, social workers, policymakers, and liberal journalists. In this sense, its influence was most keenly felt in domains other than the literary field. A Mind That Found Itself was the spark that inaugurated and galvanized the amorphous mental hygiene movement in the first decades of the 20th century, one of America's most powerful psychiatric, medical, social, bureaucratic, and ultimately eugenicist institutions. Before its publication, Beers sent the book to several high-end public officials, hoping to use his story of mental illness and mental health to procure the necessary capital for the creation of a national committee for mental hygiene. And eventually he receives funding from a wealthy industrialist called Henry Phipps, the philanthropist who also set up the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And Beers also received some money from the Rockefeller Foundation, a very famous and very corrupt so-called charitable organization in America. Now, despite their turbulent relationship, Adolf Meyer, who was a Baltimorean psychiatrist that became the kind of elder statesman of mental health in the first decades of the 20th century, would in fact go on to credit a mind that found itself with the very espousal of the mental hygiene concept at the first International Congress for Mental Hygiene in 1932, suggesting that the link between the literary imaginary and the mental hygiene movement was not coincidental, it was constitutive. The literary comparisons a mind that found itself routinely attracted thus index a shared vision of the spectacular utility of the book's literariness, namely that its style was essential to its social and reformist purpose, functioning as more than the merely aesthetic or the ornamental. Right? It's not often that a book succeeds in creating a kind of a massive social movement. Now, a mind that found itself began the mental hygiene movement because it provided discursive scaffolding, with James, as Beers recounts, recognizing, quote, the genuineness of his personal experience and its value for propaganda. The idea that the literary could and indeed should play a part in successful reformism was one Beers gleaned from the social successes of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the previous century. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel was in fact another literary touchstone for Beers, and he writes towards the end of A Mind That Found Itself, why cannot a book be written which will help all the slaves of all creeds and colors confined today in the asylums and sanitariums throughout the world? And this is a very ironic comparison, given that, as I'll talk about later, the mental hygiene movement would assume some very racist, very eugenicist policies. So for Beers, and by extension for the mental hygiene movement more broadly, the aesthetic was thus reformist, and reformism required an aesthetic. In fact, Beers ends his book by writing, authors, the creators of opinion. As Cross, the professor of Yale, who once taught Beers when he was an undergraduate there, put it in a tribute to Beers, the book this Yale man wrote in his youth, he was 32 when it was published, belongs to our American literature and is regarded as a classic everywhere. And if you could just change the slides, that would be fantastic. So why A Mind That Found Itself made such an impact on the social and epistemic destiny of American psychiatry, and what the confluence of these two seemingly distinct domains of thought bring to light about early 20th century America are thus questions worth pursuing. Again, if I could just have the next slide, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Many asylum exposés had been published in the years prior to Beers's autobiography, and they were notably authored by women, right? But they failed to make the same impact as those biographies like Clarissa Thorpe's A Secret Institution from 1890 were more concerned with contesting psychiatric power rather than the complex mix of contestation and consolidation that defines the legacy of Beers's work. Now, one reason for its success and one reason why Beers's writing resonated was precisely his self-identification as a Yale man. And if you read A Mind That Found Itself, you realize that this phrase, Yale man, is used throughout the whole book and commentaries on it. And it kind of functions as a signifier for the supposed equality of mental illness, that mental illness can even strike those who went to Yale. You know, it's kind of an ironic thing, right? But more profoundly, psychiatrists tended to agree that Beers's book contributed something fundamental to what was then an emerging form of psychiatric knowledge, one the psychiatrist Edwin Boring characterized as, quote, a shift of emphasis from mental disease to mental health. Indeed, Fred J. Conselman, who was a psychiatrist at a state hospital in California, phrased this more strongly still in a review of Beers's book, writing, Beers's accomplishment is more than a popularization of science. It represents the emergence of a new science, the science of mental health. And Beers's book, Conselman went on to comment, is epoch-making. So whether hyperbolic or not, the argument is in my paper is that the signifier mental health has lost the historicity that Conzelmann's remark implies, being so ubiquitous a psychological descriptor that its historical uniqueness, the fact that it emerged in 1908, has faded unremarked into the fabric of 20th and 21st century capitalist modernity. Now, Thomas Szasz, not the greatest guy of all time, but Thomas Szasz notes the historical novelty of mental health and its relationship to modern America, remarking that for thousands of years, people looked upon life as a veil of tears. You wait until you die, and then you'll be happy in the afterlife. That was the whole idea throughout human history until the last 50 years in America. Rereading Beers's autobiography then thus delivers a profound way to trace the aesthetic history of mental health, joining recent scholarship on the topic like Heather Murray's Asylum Ways of Seeing from 2022. Just as one might wonder about the multiple and sometimes contradictory psychological and social uses of the terms mental health, in his classic study of American society and insanity, Gerald N. Grob points out that the same kind of referential indeterminacy was present in mental health's previous iteration, mental hygiene. Mental hygiene came to replace the 19th century watchword prevention and denoted at once an attempt to improve conditions for the so-called insane, a new scientific and psychiatric program, a full-blown eugenicist movement, which I'll discuss shortly, and, quote, a step towards reaching the broader needs of health, happiness, efficiency, and social adaptation, as Adolf Meyer, the famous mental hygienist, put it. And that equation, health, happiness, efficiency, and social adaptation, blurs the distinction between happiness and the manufacture of an efficient labor force, the psychical and the political. In his famous The Mentally Ill in America from 1937, the journalist Albert Deutsch notes the political vision of mental hygiene psychiatry, writing that its goal was the production of, quote, well-adjusted citizens, where the personality is to develop freely and naturally, though one wonders how a personality can be free to develop if it's also made to adapt to something. Antecedents of the phrase mental hygiene can be traced back to the 19th century. William Sweetzer's Mental Hygiene from 1843 is an early text here, but the ascendancy of the term occurred from the final years of the 19th century to the Second World War, with some like Conzelmann claiming that Beers's book marked its emergence. Now, many accounts of 20th century psychiatry, whether liberal or critical, tend to quickly skip over the role of a mind that found itself to the mental hygiene movement, always mentioning its importance, but stopping short of examining its aesthetic vision of mental and national health. However, Beers's book was not an incidental feature of the mental hygiene movement, the science of mental health, or the politics of social adaptation. It was rather essential, giving discursive force to the law. Can you change the slide if that's okay? Thank you. This is an essay that returns, thanks, to the scene of that emergence, which happened to be a literary emergence, in order to contribute to the history of 20th century American psychiatry. That history is also an aesthetic history of the psychologization of political life. The idea that we are often asked to look inside if we're struggling to cope with what's going on outside. Broadly speaking, and this is something I'll go on to discuss now, the psychiatric theory that underpinned the mental hygiene movement routinely turned to writing and literature to theorize what they called the functional psychoses, using Beers's book to clarify certain features of the symptomatology of a new condition that they called manic depressive psychosis. And this, I'm going to argue, is why Beers's book resonated, because it coincided with this new psychiatric milieu. But just as much as Beers's book resonated, it also consolidated a certain idea of psychiatric power. And it was used very much to propagate this idea of social adaptation, the idea that, you know, mental illness was defined as kind of, you know, not being able to adapt to the to society. And Beers is often remembered as a kind of well-intentioned liberal social reformer who was, had his kind of a man who tried to do good and who tried to do his best, as one critic put it. But I want to read him more ambiguously as someone who is really interested in resuturing the relationships between politics and psychiatry. So to give some context here, in an essay from 1908 entitled Insanity in the Nation, a journalist called H. Addington Bruce worried about the fate of the American nation. The results of the 12th US Census had showed an alarming trend. Between 1880 and 1890, the population of the country increased by 25%, but that increase was completely overshadowed by the 85% jump in the asylum population. The figures from the next decade were even worse. Between 1890 and 1903, the census showed that the asylum population grew by more than 100%, against an increase of less than 30% in the total population. Bruce briefly considers the idea that this increase is the result of an America that had, quote, lost much of the old-time prejudice against asylums, and so people were more willing to accept speaking out and getting help. But having been sent an advanced copy of A Mind That Found Itself by William James earlier that year, Bruce concedes that Beers's book shows the asylum system to be too flawed to be a desirable destination. The more troubling increase was thus not due to the destigmatization of mental illness, but rather to the rise of social disunity, the sense that mental illness was fragmenting in America, that people were worried was already too fragmented. In Bruce's eyes, what explained the rise of the asylum population was, quote, a lack of adaptation to the exigencies of civilization. As Bruce saw it, insanity was not necessarily a pathology that resided in the mind. It was instead a socially produced phenomenon. Mental illness was the natural corollary of the tension between one's own psychical life and, quote, the multiplication of human activities, the growing complexities of the concerns and relations of everyday life. In other words, one went insane because they could not adapt to modern America. Now, at the beginning of A Mind That Found Itself, Beers positions himself precisely as a well-adapted American, a promising young man on the verge of scaling the heights of American society. Indeed, Beers's war against mental illness troubled him so profoundly because it disrupted his successful social adaptation, his Wall Street ambitions, and his desire for financial capital. And says, in fact, he writes a whole chapter on how, quote unquote, the making of money was a passion of mine, he says. Beers writes that, quote, his childhood was not unlike those of other American boys, and his parentage, quote unquote, was the happy union of a Northern man and a Southern woman, and left his blood, quote, truly American. This national identification follows a set of military metaphors, marshaled to lend pathos to the severity of his psychical battle. And this is the quote from the PowerPoint. He says, the biographical part of my autobiography might be called the history of a mental civil war, which I fought single-handed on a battlefield that lay within the compass of my skull. An army of unreason, composed of the cunning and treacherous thoughts of an unfair foe, attacked my bewildered consciousness with cruel persistency and would have destroyed me, had not a triumphant reason finally interposed a superior strategy that saved me from my unnatural self. So Beers frames his as a battle for the mind of an all-American man, a quote-unquote mental civil war, where the boundary between individual subjectivity and nationhood are blurred. In fact, the phrase civil war itself echoes precisely the North and South split, of which Beers would declare himself just on the next page, the happy union. A pen rather than a lance has been my weapon of offense and defense, he later writes, injecting the military metaphor with a reference to literary attack, as if the Civil War were to be overcome with convincing wartime propaganda. And when Beers gets into trouble with one of the attendants from the Connecticut State Asylum, He writes, "Rebellion was my watchword. Mine could only be expressed in words, the attendants only in grim acts. The literary here becoming a weapon in his fight against mental illness and his subsequent battle for patients' rights." Now, despite the fact that Beers's book takes place just in a kind of parochial East Coast geography, consisting essentially in the book of Connecticut and Wall Street, Beers saw a mind that found itself as a book that could galvanize a nation it was simultaneously attempting to bring into being. An America founded on, paradoxically, the destigmatization of mental illness on the one hand and social adaptation on the other. So the rights of the individual and social conformity, which is a very American paradox, right? America's the land of the individual, and yet it punishes those who deviate from its norms, perhaps more harshly than, its cousins in Europe. Now, if this America were to occur, Beers thought, then it needed a new literary voice. Would you mind changing the slides again? I'm so sorry to make you do this, but thank you. Oh,
No,
actually,
sir,
not
totally
quite yet.
fine.
Okay, amazing, thanks. If this America were to occur, it needed a new literary voice. Indeed, literature for Beers had in the 19th century assumed a tolerant and didactic social function. In fact, the book is just littered with references to works from 19th century literature that he thinks have gone a long way to destigmatize social illness. But more broadly, ideas of speech and writing structure the whole book and define Beers's own psychopathology, as well as his national identification as an American. The book begins with Beers becoming a mute and concludes with him employing a stenographer to transcribe a mind that found itself, an act that discloses how the narrative arc of the autobiography is complete at the very moment that Beers finds his voice. And how often do we hear that today? The idea that one has to speak one's truth, tell one's story, that mental health is linked in some way to the voice and to speaking. So alongside his initial delusion, which sends him into the hospital, Beers complains of a, quote, hellish vocal hum. And by the end of the narrative, he embarks on a proficient letter writing campaign to advertise his reformism. These are all quotes from the book. So Beers begins his journey with mental illness by suffering aphasic incomprehension, not being able to read and write. And that then morphs into a sense that he must read and write, that reading and writing are essential to his journey. He displaces his delusion onto literary writing, right? That's one thing that happens in the book. Anyway, now I note this not because I want to contribute to discussions about Beers's psychopathology or Beers's symptom. I don't want to read him in that way, but I want to show how the relations between reading, writing, speaking, and psychopathology were reconfigured by the mental hygiene movement. As Beers wrote, A Mind That Found Itself, psychiatrists associated with the movement, a psychiatrist associated with the movement examined the very alternation in speech Beers described, viewing the bipolarity between muteness and resplendent speech, aphasia and signifying abundance, as a marker of a distinct psychopathology. Now, at the turn of the century, at the same time Beers is writing, many proto-mental hygienists were exploring a group of illnesses they called the functional psychoses. Whereas the organic psychoses were thought to be caused by lesions on the brain, the functional psychoses had no obvious biological origin and were split into categories like schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, paranoid psychosis, and the rarely used hysterical psychosis. Now, one book here is Eugene Bloiler's Dementia Praecox, or the Group of Schizophrenias, which is from 1911. And this is the book that first uses the term schizophrenia. Now, the categories that Bloiler and his colleague, Emil Kraepelin, who I'll talk about, used, like schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, were actually brought into America by Beers and Adolf Meyer, the psychiatrist associated with the movement. So they're very important, Kraepelin and Bloiler. Now, for anyone who knows the history of psychiatry, as I'm sure many are familiar with here, they'll know that Michel Foucault famously called psychiatry a monologue of reason about madness in the history of madness. So a monologue of reason about madness. But if you read Bloiler and Kraepelin's work, they sought instead to locate the reason in madness, listening to psychotic speech in order to understand the threads of association holding it together. Now, in Bloiler's work on schizophrenia, he pushed back against the idea that delusions were the fundamental symptoms of schizophrenia, suggesting instead that the condition was characterized by, quote, deeper disturbances of association and affectivity. In fact, he argues that schizophrenic speech is not governed by, quote, an overarching concept of purpose. One patient, he recounts, has the goal of writing, but nothing to write about. Now, for Bloiler, schizophrenia is marked by a kind of speech without telos, a speech without idea. But the same could not be said of manic depressive psychosis, which was the subject of a book by Kraepelin written in the 1880s, but only published into English in the 1920s. Now, like Bloiler, Kraepelin thought that manic depressive psychosis was not characterized by delusion, hallucination, or paranoia, although these were certainly features, he thought, of a manic episode. He saw manic depressive psychosis instead as a structural temperament, a deep and fundamental way of relating to the world, which only attracted medical attention when it was particularly severe. And the corollary of this idea is that one could have a manic depressive psychosis without necessarily being ill, a kind of what Lacanian psychoanalysts call today ordinary psychosis. The idea that manic depressive psychosis is not something that you have, but something that you are, a fundamental way of relating to the world. Now, in his rich descriptions of psychopathology, which are drawn from his clinical practice, Kraepelin underscores the special role that writing plays in manic depressive psychosis, documenting how many of his patients develop a proclivity for writing. He also foreshadows the muteness that Beers describes in his book, suggesting that the depressive phase of manic depressive psychosis was characterized by a type of speech that was, as he observed in one patient, labored, low, monotonous, and monosyllabic. Now, like Bloiler, Kraepelin relies on the speech of his patients, which is also a kind of literary speaking, to illustrate the depressive position. In fact, he cites Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther from 1774, a literary text, to describe what depression without hallucination looks like. Now, Kraepelin does push back against the strict division of mania from depression that the term manic depressive psychosis implies, arguing for a subtler theory of what he calls mixed states. But he also comments on how the extremes of manic depressive psychosis are mirrored in the subject's relationship to writing. One phase characterized by muteness and inaction, and another by elation and bursts of creativity. Now, if you just see here, this slide and the next one are examples of a patient's writing that he's recorded in the midst of a particular manic episode. So if you just skip to the next slide too, you'll see another example he gives of a patient with manic depressive psychosis. Aren't these phenomenal recordings? Very phenomenal that we have these documents. So if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Several prominent psychiatrists diagnosed Beers as, quote, a not particularly unusual case of manic depressive psychosis in reviews of a mind that found itself. And indeed, Beers really, ends the book with this kind of resplendent speech. And here's the kind of triumphant passage from the book, which I read you. He says, from sheer excess of emotion, I would burst into verse, into poetry of a quality not to be doubted. Before writing these lines, I have never attempted verse in my life, barring intentionally in inane doggerel. And as I judge these lines now, it's probably true that even yet I have never written a poem. Nevertheless, my involuntary, almost automatic outburst is at least suggestive of a fervor that was in me. These 14 lines were written within 30 minutes of the time I conceived them, and I present them substantially as they took form. So if you could skip to the next slide, this is a poem that's included in his book. Man's darkest hour is the hour before he's born. Another is the hour just before the dawn. From darkness unto light, and light he leaps, to life but once, to light as oft as God wills he should. 'Tis God's own secret why some live long and others early die. For light depends on light, and light on God, who hath given man the perfect knowledge that grim despair and sorrow end in light, but not the light man knows, which only is light because God told man so. Now, I'm just going to skip ahead slightly to the next part of the paper because I realize we're a bit pushed for time. But, you know, this is how the book ends, right? With this song of mental health. But you can see how religious it is. It's steeped in this language of God's light, God's chosen one, and so on, you know. And moreover, the poem, and perhaps we can talk about this later, the poem kind of doesn't make sense, right? It's held together by assonance, by rhyme, you know, light, life, once, wills, you know, all these kind of resonances, phonemic resonances, rather than, you know, it being a kind of poem where you know what it is. So Bleuler and Kraepelin were also staunch eugenicists from Europe and anti-Semites, and at times they advocated for brutal forms of sterilization. And I kind of want to end this paper on a provocation, which is that the mental hygiene movement from 1908 to 1940 advocated for brutal sterilizations of so-called mentally ill people in Kansas, California, and indeed in Connecticut. And from 1908 to 1940, the mental hygiene movement was responsible for sterilizing 18,000 mentally ill people. And part of what happened here is that the mental hygiene movement began to articulate a philosophy of what they called social adaptation. So if you can go to the next slide, that would be fantastic. From the first journal of the Mental Hygiene Bulletin, which was published by Beers, they talk about the nature of social adaptation. So they say the part played by mental factors in certain kinds of failure in social adaptation has long been recognized. Today, we realize that human behavior can be neither successfully studied nor effectively directed without taking into account the facts of mental life, providing a new link, as it were, of mechanisms of the mind and the affairs of the individual and of society. And that's Beers writing there with other mental hygienists. So the question is, adapted to what? What are you going to adapt to? And for the mental hygiene movement, the issue was that nobody could precisely articulate the kind of society, the kind of America the populace should adapt to. In fact, various mental hygienists had vastly different ideas of America, whereas for Beers, the America was Wall Street and Connecticut. For Frankfurt Williams, who was eventually took over from Beers as one of the directors of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, he was so disillusioned with America that he went to the Soviet Union in 1929, so just after the economic crash in America, and authored a book called Soviet Russia Fights Neurosis in 1934, arguing that mental health was only possible under Soviet communism and not American capitalism. And indeed, many mental hygienists were concerned that economic depression resulted in psychical depression, almost as if there was something manic depressive about American capitalism itself, which followed the same logics of boom and bust, elevation and deprivation as the then ubiquitous psychopathology. Now, I just end the paper by saying that Beers's book is precisely a narrative of social adaptation, of returning to normal. And the final scene of the book is that Beers goes to a doctor because he feels himself becoming sick again, having another manic episode. And the doctor calms him down because he calls him a gentleman. And this signifier of social respectability, of cultural capital, is enough for Beers to declare himself socially adapted to America. So I'll just end this paper by saying, and if you could just skip to the last slide, thanks. Beers' A Mind That Found Itself indexes the dream, the American dream of a society without suffering, a society that would give, in Adolph Myers's words, more attention to the health, happiness, and efficiency of the rank and file of the people. But revisiting the book and the pathological modes of reading it attracted allows us to interrogate those feelings, underscoring how the political became entangled with the psychological, how the psychological was bolstered by the literary, and how the mental hygiene movement sanctioned a historically particular idea of what it meant to be happy and healthy in America. A Mind That Found Itself is not just a work about manic depressive psychosis or about giving a voice to the voiceless. It's also a book about nationhood, about social engineering, about psychical and social adaptation, and about the complex ways in which the idea of mental health was always already synonymous with anxieties about the health of the nation. It's in this sense that examining the literary origins of mental health psychiatry allows us to more critically view the very contemporary and individualist notion that telling one's story is the key to achieving mental health. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was okay.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay,
My absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for that enlightening talk on the fascinating history of the mental hygiene movement. And the topic that you have chosen is really an example of how literature really impacts the society. Through this movement also we can see that ultimately it ended up talking about the nation and it had those political connections, as you mentioned. So definitely thank you so much for this very, very enlightening talk. So,
oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's just such an honor. Thank you.
Okay, so before we go ahead, we will be taking some questions. We already have a question in our Q&A section. I'll request other participants also to please put in their questions in the Q&A section. So this question is from Madhavi Sood. She is asking that there is a lot of discrimination, especially here in the East, towards people suffering from mental illness like bipolar disorders, schizophrenia. So in the West, maybe that situation may be a little bit better, but in the East, still it's a very, very huge taboo. So how do you think we should bridge this huge gap between literature and action steps so that the dignity of humanity can be maintained? So that's a question. So over to you, sir.
Well, thank you so much for the question, and it's fantastic to hear about the situation in the East. I would say that I'm a historian of psychiatry, historian of psychoanalysis in some way. A lot of people, the idea of stigmatization already implies an ideal of what's normal, right? And in societies, we have different ideas of what counts as normal. And in America at the time, there was a rather fixed idea of what was normal. To be normal, one had to be an active social contributor, right? They had to have a job. They had to not attract legal attention and so on. Now, if anyone's here familiar with psychoanalysis, there was a very famous psychoanalyst who was a student of Freud's called Ernest Jones. And he wrote a very beautiful essay called The Concept of Normal. Now, Ernest Jones was running a mental hygiene clinic in Canada at the time. But he said that if one wanted to be normal, they had to be fearless. And they had to confront their desires and their wishes without renouncing them or acting in relation to them in defensive ways. And I think that's a kind of better idea of normal, an idea of normal that we can embrace rather than having a very capitalist, a very conservative idea of normality where one's just a good social contributor and then they and then they don't attract any attention. I think we have we're better served if we have an idea of normality that allows people to follow their own desire and not react to their wishes with fearlessness. Now, I don't know if that answers the question, because I'm always nervous about answering big questions like that, because I don't want to be too prescriptive. And of course, you know, I can speak to the situation in Australia and in America, but I'm not sure I can speak to the situation in India. I'm sure that people better served than I to do that. But very interesting question. So thank you very much.